I never thought an ordinary Wednesday could turn my entire world upside down. But there I was, sitting on the bench in the locker room, the cold wood pressing into the backs of my thighs as I really tried, to keep my thoughts from spiraling out of control. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, their buzz just loud enough to make the silence around me feel even heavier. My gym bag sat at my feet, half-zipped and forgotten, while my mind twisted itself into knots I couldn't untangle. Mary was only a few feet away, completely oblivious to the chaos she was stirring inside me. She always had that effect on people, on me. Being in the same room with her was like standing in the eye of a hurricane, calm on the surface but knowing full well that the storm was waiting, just out of reach. And Mary, she was the storm. Loud, vibrant, unstoppable. She laughed like the world was hers, talked like she had nothing to prove, and walked with the kind of confidence that made you question your own. I both admired her and feared her. Admired the way she seemed so unapologetically herself. Feared the way she made me feel so small and so seen all at once. Around her, I couldn't hide, not my thoughts, not my nerves, not the way my heart raced every time she glanced my way. That afternoon had already been heavy. Work was a mess, my head ached from staring at screens all day, and I'd come to the gym hoping to burn off the weight pressing on my chest. But instead of relief, I found Mary. Or rather, she found me. She always did. She stood by her locker now, rummaging through her bag for something, her every movement casual and unbothered. I tried not to watch, but my eyes betrayed me, flicking toward her without permission. She tossed her towel over her shoulder and pulled her hair into a messy bun, a few loose strands falling around her face. The fluorescent light caught on her skin, highlighting the curve of her shoulder, the line of her collarbone. My breath hitched, and I looked away, my pulse thudding loudly in my ears. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like this. This pull, this strange ache in my chest whenever I was around her, it had been there for as long as I could remember. But today it felt different. Sharper. Louder. Like my body had decided that today was the day I wouldn't be able to ignore it anymore. Mary's voice broke through my thoughts, bright and teasing. "You okay over there?" she asked without turning around, her words laced with that easy confidence that was so inherently her. She didn't even have to look at me to know I was a mess. I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded normal. "Yeah, just tired." She glanced over her shoulder then, her eyes meeting mine for half a second before she turned back to her bag. "Long day?" she asked, her tone casual, like she didn't know the weight of her presence was enough to turn my insides to mush. "Something like that," I muttered, my fingers gripping the edge of the bench as I tried to steady myself. She shrugged, her movements loose and easy, and turned away again, her attention back on whatever she was looking for. I let out a shaky breath, my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched her pull her shirt over her head. She didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. She was always so unself-conscious, so free in her movements, and it made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. I should have looked away. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. The room felt warmer, the air thicker as she moved. Her every gesture seemed magnified, running her fingers through her hair, adjusting the strap of her sports bra, bending slightly to grab her water bottle. It was all so normal, so routine, but in that moment, it felt like the world had slowed to half speed. My throat was dry, my palms clammy, and all I could do was sit there, trying to act like I wasn't completely unraveling on the inside. The worst part was how familiar it felt. That same twisting in my gut, the same heat rising to my face, the same inability to look at her without feeling like I was on the edge of something I couldn't quite understand. I'd felt it 100 times before, but it never stopped being overwhelming. Mary moved to the mirror, adjusting her hair again, her movements careless but deliberate in a way only she could pull off. I tried to distract myself, rummaging through my bag even though I didn't need anything, but my hands were trembling, and I could barely focus on what I was doing. I glanced up, just for a moment, and caught her watching me in the mirror. Her eyes met mine through the reflection, and for a split second, I swore there was something different in the way she looked at me. Something sharp, almost curious. My chest tightened, and I quickly looked away, pretending to search for something in my bag as my thoughts spiraled. I didn't know how much longer I could sit there, pretending everything was normal when it was anything but. The tension in the air felt like a living thing, wrapping itself around me, pulling tighter and tighter until I thought I might snap. Mary turned back to her locker, humming softly under her breath as she grabbed a fresh shirt and tossed it over her shoulder. "You're awfully quiet," she said, her tone light but tinged with amusement. I forced another laugh, even though it felt like my chest was going to cave in. "Just tired," I repeated, my voice weak, barely above a whisper. She looked at me then, really looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly like she could see right through me. And maybe she could. She always had a way of knowing, of understanding things about me I wasn't ready to admit. "Well, snap out of it," she said, grinning as she walked back to the bench. She grabbed her towel and slung it over her shoulder, standing so close that I could smell the faint hint of her perfume, a mix of something sweet and warm that made my head spin. The fluorescent light flickered again, casting strange shadows across the room as she sat down beside me. Too close. Closer than she needed to be. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse roaring in my ears, and all I could do was sit there, frozen, as the storm inside me threatened to break loose. It was then that it happened. Mary finished tying her hair, her hands quick and practiced as she pulled it into a high ponytail. She turned toward me, her movements casual, but when I looked up, her eyes caught mine, and something in them made my breath hitch. She had that same easy smile she always wore, the one that made everything seem light and harmless. But today there was something else behind it, something sharper, almost provocative. I tried to look away, to busy myself with the zipper on my gym bag or adjust my shoes. Anything to avoid the weight of her gaze. But before I could even attempt it, she moved. She tossed her towel to the side, letting it crumple onto the bench, and then, without warning, she sat down next to me. Close. So close that our shoulders touched, the warmth of her skin seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt. "Something's up with you today," she said, tilting her head as she looked at me. Her tone was casual, almost playful, but there was a thread of curiosity running through it, something more pointed than her usual teasing. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the breath that had suddenly caught in my chest. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly, the words tumbling out of me in a rush that felt anything but convincing. My voice sounded weak, almost shaky, and I hated how transparent I was in front of her. She didn't buy it. Of course, she didn't buy it. Mary had always been able to read me like a book, peeling back layers I didn't even realize I was wearing. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, the corner of her mouth twitching like she was holding back a smirk. "Yeah," she said, the word drawn out, her tone skeptical but amused. I nodded, my throat tight, and forced myself to meet her gaze. Big mistake. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching, prying, and I felt like she could see right through me. My pulse quickened, the sound of it loud in my ears, drowning out the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above us. Before I could think of what to say next, before I could find some excuse to get up and put space between us, she moved again. Her hand landed on my thigh, lightly at first, almost hesitant, but then she let it rest there, her palm warm against my skin even through the fabric of my leggings. My entire body went rigid. It was such a small gesture, simple and innocent on the surface, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight through me. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive at once, my senses suddenly hyper-aware of every tiny detail. The way her fingers curled slightly, the faint pressure of her touch, the steady warmth radiating from her hand. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything except that single point of contact. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, quieter, but with an undercurrent of something that made my stomach twist. Concern, maybe. Or amusement. Or something else entirely. Her fingers shifted just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that I couldn't ignore it. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt dry, my mind a complete blank. All I could focus on was the weight of her hand, the way it seemed to anchor me in place, while simultaneously sending my thoughts spinning out of control. She leaned in closer, her head tilting just enough to catch my eye, and when I finally managed to look at her, there it was again, that smile. That infuriating, knowing smile that made it impossible to tell what she was thinking, but left me feeling like she already knew everything I was trying to hide. "Are you sure?" she pressed, her tone light, almost teasing, but her eyes were anything but. They were steady, focused, like she was studying me, waiting for a reaction I wasn't sure I could give. "I'm sure," I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. It was a lie, of course. Nothing about this felt fine. My thoughts were a tangled mess, my chest tight, my hands clenched so hard against the bench that my knuckles ached. But I couldn't bring myself to say anything else, couldn't admit to the turmoil that was threatening to swallow me whole. Her smile widened just a little, and for a moment I thought she might laugh. But she didn't. Instead, she let her fingers trace a small, lazy circle against my thigh, a motion so subtle I almost thought I'd imagined it. Almost. The touch was light, almost playful, but the effect it had on me was anything but. "Relax," she said, the words soft but firm, like a command. "You're so tense." I let out a shaky breath, trying to pull myself together, but her hand didn't move. If anything, the weight of it seemed heavier now, more deliberate, and it felt like the air around us had thickened, the space between us charged with something unspoken. "Mary, I started, but my voice cracked and the words died on my tongue. She laughed then, a quiet, low laugh that sent a shiver racing down my spine. "What?" she asked, her tone light but laced with amusement. "Why are you so nervous?" "I'm not nervous," I said quickly, the words coming out too fast, too defensive. Her eyebrow arched, and she leaned in just a fraction closer. "No," she said, her voice dropping lower, softer, like she was sharing a secret. "Then why do you look like you're about to jump out of your skin?" I didn't have an answer. My thoughts were too jumbled, too tangled to form a coherent response, and all I could do was sit there, frozen, as she looked at me with that maddening mix of curiosity and certainty. The hand on my thigh didn't move, and neither did I. The air between us seemed to hum with tension, so thick and heavy that it was almost suffocating. And through it all, that smile stayed on her lips, teasing and knowing, as if she was perfectly aware of the effect she was having on me, and enjoying every second of it. "I'm fine," I managed to say, but the words came out shaky, my voice betraying the storm of confusion churning inside me. I wanted it to sound convincing, solid, but it didn't. And Mary, sharp as ever, caught it immediately. Her eyebrow arched, and she gave me this look, half curious, half challenging, that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just a question she was asking. It was a test. Her hand was still on my thigh, her fingers resting there like they belonged, like they weren't doing exactly what they were doing to me. I tried to ignore the warmth of her touch, the way it spread through my skin like wildfire, but it was impossible. Every inch of me felt too aware of her, and the space between us seemed smaller than ever. Too small. "Are you really?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. She tilted her head slightly, leaning just a fraction closer, and suddenly, the air felt heavier, charged. Her perfume reached me then, a mix of something floral and sweet, with just a hint of something warmer beneath it, and my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. I should have moved. I should have said something, anything, to break the moment, to give myself room to breathe. But I didn't. My body refused to listen to my mind, and instead, I just sat there frozen, staring at her like I didn't know what to do. Because truthfully, I didn't. Her lips curved into a faint smile, and then she laughed, a soft, low sound that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a cruel laugh, but it wasn't entirely kind either. It was amused, like she could see right through me and was enjoying the effect she had on me. And maybe she was. "You know," she said, her voice lighter now, almost conversational, as if we were talking about something mundane. Her fingers shifted slightly against my thigh, tracing a lazy, almost absent-minded circle over the fabric of my leggings. The motion was subtle, but it sent a shiver racing up my spine. I was thinking, we never really talk. I blinked at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. My heart was still pounding, my mind still racing, and her words felt like they were coming from somewhere far away. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quiet, cautious. Her smile deepened, and she tilted her head again, studying me like she was trying to decide whether or not I was worth explaining herself to. "I mean, we never talk about the important stuff," she said, her tone softening, but there was still an edge to it. "You know, the things that actually matter." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. I knew exactly what she meant. Her fingers continued their slow, deliberate movement, the small circles drawing patterns I couldn't see but could feel. My body was hyper-aware of every single point of contact, and it was all I could do not to flinch. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it wasn't. That was the problem. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was too much, too overwhelming, and I didn't know how to handle it. Mary laughed again, a quiet, breathy sound that sent a ripple of heat through me. "Sure you don't," she said, her voice teasing but not unkind. "You're always so quiet, you know? Like you're afraid to say what you're really thinking." I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, but nothing came out. She was right, and we both knew it. I didn't know how to be anything other than quiet around her, how to hide the mess of feelings that always seemed to bubble up whenever we were alone like this. "See," she said, her voice softening even more. "This is what I mean. We never really talk. You're always holding back." I didn't know how to respond to that. My chest felt tight, my hands clenched into fists on my lap as I fought to keep myself steady. Her fingers stopped moving for just a moment, and then they pressed a little more firmly against my thigh, grounding me in a way that was almost cruel. "Why do you do that?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "Why do you always act like you're afraid to let go?" Her words cut through me like a knife, sharp and precise, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind scrambled for something to say, some way to deflect, to shift the focus off of me and onto something else, but nothing came. I could feel her watching me, waiting, and the weight of her gaze was almost unbearable. "Mary," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. She leaned in closer, her face just inches from mine now, and I could feel the heat radiating off her skin. "What?" she asked, her voice low, her tone challenging but gentle. "What are you so afraid of?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I couldn't say it. Couldn't admit it. The tension between us was suffocating, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling into something I wasn't sure I could handle. Her fingers started moving again, tracing that same lazy circle, and her smile softened just a little. "It's okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to tell me. I already know." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to ignore, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at her, my chest tight, my heart racing. Because the truth was, she did know. She'd always known. Suddenly, she leaned in even closer, so close that I could feel her breath against my skin. The faintest trace of it tickled my cheek, warm and deliberate, and I swore the world tilted beneath me. Our faces were barely inches apart now, the space between us electric, charged with something so heavy it was almost suffocating. "If I do something, will you stop me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, low and soft and devastatingly intimate. The words wrapped around me, burrowed into my chest, and I couldn't tell if it was the question or the way she said it that left me completely undone. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she might hear it, and I couldn't tell if the rush of blood in my ears was drowning out the rest of the world, or if the world had simply stopped existing altogether. Time felt warped, stretched thin, as I sat there frozen, my body betraying me even as my mind screamed for some kind of answer, some kind of escape. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond to a question like that, a question that cracked me open and left me exposed in a way I wasn't ready for. My throat felt dry, my hands clenched tight against my thighs, and all I could do was look at her, at the way her eyes burned into mine, searching, daring me to say something. To stop her. To not stop her. I wanted to say something. I wanted to move, to break the moment before it broke me. But I couldn't. And then, just as suddenly as she'd leaned in, Mary stood up. The bench groaned beneath her weight as she moved, the sound cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. The sudden shift was jarring, and for a moment, I didn't understand what was happening. She stood there, towering over me now, her presence still so consuming it felt like she hadn't really moved at all. I tilted my head up to look at her, my chest still heaving, and she stared back down at me with an expression I couldn't read. There was something in her eyes, something sharp and knowing and so deeply challenging that it made my breath catch all over again. She wasn't smiling, not yet, but the corners of her mouth were tugging upward, her lips curving ever so slightly, like she was on the verge of something that only she understood. "I knew it," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, even, but there was something in the way she said it that felt like a victory. "I knew you wouldn't say anything." Her smile widened then, slow and deliberate, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. There wasn't a trace of malice in it, but it wasn't kind either. It was confident, self-assured, like she'd just proven something she'd always suspected. Like she'd just won. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. My throat was still tight, my mind still spinning, and she just stood there, watching me with that same maddening certainty. She didn't look smug. She looked satisfied, like she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. And then she turned and walked away. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the small space, each one ringing out louder than it should have. She grabbed her towel as she passed by, slinging it over her shoulder with the same casual ease she always carried, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just tilted my entire world off its axis. The locker room door creaked open, and she paused just long enough to glance back over her shoulder. Her eyes met mine one last time, and that knowing smile tugged at her lips again. It wasn't teasing anymore. It was a promise. And then she was gone. The door swung shut behind her with a dull thud, and the silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, frozen, my body still humming with adrenaline, my thoughts a tangled mess I couldn't begin to untangle. The room felt emptier without her in it, but somehow the weight of her presence lingered, heavy and impossible to ignore. Even after she was gone, I could still feel her. The heat of her hand on my thigh, the soft tickle of her breath against my skin, the weight of her words wrapping around me like chains. The memory of her touch burned into me, leaving a mark I wasn't sure I wanted to erase. Something had changed between us. I didn't know what it was, didn't know how to name it, but I could feel it like a shift in the air, like a storm brewing on the horizon. And the worst part, the part that terrified me, even as it thrilled me, was that I didn't want to ignore it. Not really. Not anymore. I leaned back against the bench, my head tilting up to stare at the ceiling as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my mind still spinning, and no matter how hard I tried to calm down, I couldn't. Her words echoed in my head over and over, like a song I couldn't turn off. I knew you wouldn't say anything. And she was right. I hadn't. I couldn't. Because the truth I'd been running from, denying, hiding from for as long as I could remember, was that a part of me didn't want her to stop. A part of me didn't want her to go. And that part terrified me.